Before I start to work on the other roofs, I want to prep and paint the styrofoam ball that's going to go on the top of the North Pole, and that'll give it plenty of time to dry. So this is a smooth styrofoam ball, but it still has kind of a little ridge right here in the middle going around. So I'm going to just take an emery board and see if I can't get rid of that little ridge that's along there. Don't worry about this in the bottom. We're going to use that to our advantage, and the top side on mine is already smooth. Once I have that ridge pretty much smoothed out, I'm going to paint this with some pearl paint. If you don't have pearl, you could just use white, or you could cover this however you want to. And it may take a couple of coats, and if it's been hard to remove that ridge line, you don't have to make it perfectly smooth. Just kind of texture it a little bit, and then that line won't show. And I've got it here on a toothpick, and I've got a piece of styrofoam here that I can poke the toothpick in and set it aside so it can dry. Buildings 1 and 5 each have a pyramid-shaped roof, and so they have a roof base piece and a long roof sides piece. And we'll start out by cutting the sides. So I have my side piece here on my cutting mat, and on the base of the triangles is 3 1/8. There's 4 triangles. The base is 3 1/8. So I'll start by marking 3 1/8 twice along the bottom edge. And then at the top, we want to have half of that, which is 1 9/16, or a 1/16 more than a half. So I'll start that off with a half there, and then I'll mark 2 at 3 1/8 again. And now I'm going to connect those dots. Now before I cut them apart, I'm going to mark the base on each one. I'm just putting a black dot on each base, because sometimes after you cut them apart, it's hard to tell what's a base and what's a side. And now I'll cut this into 4 triangles on those lines. Now that I have my triangles cut, I'm going to add some joining strip along the left side of each triangle. Once I get those joining strips on, I'm just going to flip it over in this position and trim off any excess on those joining strips on each one. Now that I have the joining strips trimmed, I'm going to butt the sides up against each other and just join them all in a row. And then I'll release this backing and I'll put this final join together. Take a look around the edges, and if you have any joining strip hanging over, give it a little trim. Next, we're going to attach the base, and when we do this, we're going to do it with wet glue. You can do a little dry fit here so you can see about where you need to put your glue. So about 1/8 of an inch inside of the edges in each case. And when you put this in order to keep it square, you'll want to see the same amount revealed on all of the 4 sides. So I'll go ahead and put my glue on there and attach that base. Then I'll put it down on my craft mat and make sure it is square. And if it is, I'm just going to set this aside to dry. While roof 1 is drying, we can go ahead and prep roof 5. Roof 5, I have a long strip for the sides, and I have a base piece on the sides. The base of our triangle is 2 1/8. So I'm going to mark 2 times at 2 1/8. And then our starting position on the top is half of 2 1/8 or 1 1/16. And then we'll mark 2 1/8 twice again. And then I'll connect all of my dots. Before I cut my triangles apart, again, I'll make a dot on the base of each one so I'll be able to recognize the base, and then I'll go ahead and cut these. And then I'll join these 4 triangles just like I did the roof pieces for roof number 1. Once you get all 4 sides together, do a little dry fit again with the base. This base is coming just a little bit closer to the edge. I'm going to run my glue line back about a 1/16 of an inch or so from the edge, and then I'll put this base in. And I'll put this roof again on my craft mat and make sure it is square, and then I'll allow this glue to dry. Roof 4 is a little similar to the last roofs. It has 2 triangle pieces on the 2 ends, but then it has 2 trapezoid pieces for the long sides. So I have my piece for the sides here, and I'm going to start by cutting off 2 pieces that are 4 1/4 inches long. I'll reserve those 2 4 1/4 pieces for my trapezoids, and we'll cut them in a minute. And the leftover piece I'll cut 2 triangles from. The base is 2 1/4, so I'm going to mark 2 1/4 one time on the base, and then I'll measure in half of that, or 1 1/8 on the top, and then come over 2 1/4. And I'll connect these dots, and again I'll make some marks for the base of my triangles and cut out those 2 triangles. Now for my trapezoids, I'm going to take my centering ruler and put that on the top of my 4 1/4 inch piece, and I want to mark a 2-inch length that's centered there. So I've just found center and marked 1 inch off of center, and then I can connect that dot with the corner on both sides and cut off and remove the triangles. And I'll repeat that on the other piece. Next, I'll add a joining strip on the left side of each piece, and then I'll also put one along the top of only one of the trapezoids. Now I'll join these in a row, and I'm alternating trapezoid with triangle, and I'm just going to join the left sides for now and not make it 3-dimensional. I give everything a good burnish, and before I join that 4th side over here, I'm going to remove the backing from the center piece, and now I'll kiss these corners together over here and put this last side together. And then I can reach up here and attach this piece, and I'll give those a good burnish. Then, like before, we'll do a dry fit of our base and see where we need to put our glue line. I think somewhere between a 1/16 and 1/8 of an inch in from the edge. So I'll run that bead of glue, and then I'll attach this base inside of there. And then, like before, once I get the base in there, I'll put it upside down or right side up on my craft mat here and make sure that it is staying nice and square, rectangular. Hold that for a few minutes and then set it aside to dry. Once this glue is thoroughly dry, and you want it to be thoroughly dry because we're going to use our marker on the edges here and we don't want to get glue on our marker. So once that glue is thoroughly dry, I'm going to take my marker along the bottom edges, and I'll do it and show you what it looks like. Along the sides, made sure the edges are done, and just a little bit in on the base as well. Now the easiest way to finish a triangle is to first start out with a strip and cut a 45-degree at the top there. And then hold that so that the point goes all the way up to where that intersection should be, and cut it long. Doesn't have to be too long. I'm cutting it about 1/8 of an inch long. And then go ahead and install that. When you install it, put that corner right in the corner, flip it over, look at where the corner is of the roof, and center that finishing strip on that corner. Then remove the other piece of backing and burnish it down. Once it's burnished, you can take your craft knife and do one side at a time. Just run it right along the edge of the roof on one side, turn the roof, and do the other side. And you'll get a nice finished point down there. When I work these roofs, I do one side and then the opposite side, and then I come back and do the other two sides, and I do all 4 of these joints the same way. So I'm going to do that on, this is roof 1, I'll do that on roof 5, and then I'll also do that on the triangle sides of, this is the roof for roof 4. When you go to complete this finishing up here at the top, just cut the end square, because you can see here that there's not room for a miter to have a nice clean finish. So just put that on square. Now we're ready to add decorative paper to those roofs, and for building 1, our guide says we'll use the green with stars, and so we haven't cut anything out of that paper yet, so I have 1 sheet out here already. And then on our cutting guide it says for the roof sides we need 2 at 1 7/8 by 6. And if you want your stars to kind of line up, cut a strip and then match up the bottom row of stars and cut a second strip. So here are my 2 strips, and from each one I'm going to cut a rectangle that is 2 7/8 inch wide. And there's enough room so that if you want to center the stars, you can do that. So we will need a total of 4 rectangles that are 2 7/8 inch long. Once you have your 4 rectangles, use your centering ruler to find the center at the top. Make a tick mark and connect that tick mark to each of the corners and cut that off so that you'll have a triangle. And repeat that for all 4 pieces. Now that I have my triangles cut out, I can erase any guide marks that I have and go ahead and ink them, prep them with score tape, and then go ahead and install them on each side of your roof. For roof number 4, our cutting guide says that we need 2 pieces of pattern paper that are 1 7/16 inches, that's a 1/16 less than a half, by 8. And then on our layout, it shows we're going to get those 2 strips from the piece that is red plaid and black words. We've already cut out the sides for building 8 from that paper. So here's our paper. I'm going to use the black side for this roof, and we said 1 7/16 by the length of the paper. So I'll go ahead and get that cut. So once I have my 2 pieces cut like this, I'm going to first cut off a rectangle that is 2 1/8, 2 1/8, and then I'll find center here on the top, find center, and cut off 2 triangles to make the main triangle. Then we'll cut from this remaining piece, a piece that is 4 1/8 long. Then I'm going to center it on my craft mat so I have a 1/16 of an inch hanging over each end, and I'm going to come into this inch mark and cut down to that corner. The other way to do this is just to measure 1 inch and 1/16 in from either side, and then connect that mark to the point and cut that triangle off, whichever works for you. So I repeated that for my other piece, and now I'll ink these edges and go ahead and put some score tape on them and install them on my roof. For building 5, the pattern paper for the roof is, we need 1 piece that is 1 5/8 by 5 inches. And our pattern paper layout says that that's going to come from the white with dashed lines that has the red paisley on the back. And we've already cut the 4 Annex out of that. So here's our piece, and I'm going to cut it. The red paisley, or what I call the red paisley, is going to be the finished side, and I need to reserve a strip of this down here for another roof. So I'm going to cut the piece that I said was excuse me, 1 5/8 by 5 out of this top corner right here. Now the finished side is the red side, but it's just easier to see on the white side. And I'm going to cut all 4 triangles from this piece. I don't think that it's directional. So I'm going to mark a base that is 2 inches long. I'm going to mark that twice on the bottom. And then I'll come in 1 inch on the top and mark 2 inches, and then the 5 is the last 2. And I can cut my 4 triangles out of there, go ahead and ink them and put them on my roof. Remember, the red side is the good side. And I should say that before I cut them apart, I did mark the base on each one so that I would know which side was the base when I go to install it on my roof. I'm going to work on all of the gable roofs at the same time, so I pulled them out and I made sure that each piece is labeled so I won't get them mixed up. And then I'm going to bring in the village. And each time I work on one of these roofs, I'm going to make sure that the building is nicely closed up and everything is aligned the way it's supposed to be. So I'm going to start with the roof for building 6, the reindeer barn. And all of these procedures will be the same. I'm going to take my 2 pieces of roof and get a piece of painter's tape and put them together with painter's tape. I'm going to make sure that my tape isn't coming within 1/4 of an inch of either end. And then I'm just going to do a little test fit up here on the building. Now, Building 6 comes in pretty tight next to Building 5, so it may be that this side is going to need to be trimmed. And you can tell that by looking at the front of it here. Also, if you press down, I can see that this piece is raising up. So I'm going to slice a little bit off the edge of this side of the roof, probably about a 1/16 or so to start. And that's a much better fit. You won't want to take off any more than a 1/16, and you shouldn't need to. Now make sure that the side that you trim, that you write trimmed on it, so that you know that it's going to go over here. You can write trimmed up here too if you think you'll forget which side. I'm also going to write it on the bottom because I believe you can't have too much information about that. So I'm going to do that for all of the buildings. So I'm going to start out by doing that for all of the buildings. When I have the village in this position, I can work on 7, 8, and the annex. Now the annex won't need any trimming because there's nothing running into it on either side. Let me slide it down a little bit more. You can see there's an overhang in space here. And roof 7 and roof 8 don't need any trimming because when we attach them, we can just attach them wherever we need to because they're going in this orientation. You see that the difference here with roof 6, its sidewall was bumping into something, and we don't have that situation for either one of these roofs. So I'm just going to put them together again with some painter's tape, and I'll hold that painter's tape back a 1/4 of an inch from each end, and I'll fit those roofs on top. So I've done on this side 6, 7, 8, and the annex, and you can also see that I made sure that I had a number on both sides of my roofs. Now I'm going to move the building around and do my last roof, which is number 3. Number 3, I'll go ahead and again attach the roofs underneath here with some painter's tape. And notice that this is the same kind of situation that we had with building 6. Doesn't necessarily mean we'll need to trim, but we probably will. And I can see that if I push this down, that it is pushing my North Pole a little bit. So I'm going to trim a little bit off of this side over here that's bumping in to the North Pole. And I won't go more than a 1/16. That's all it will ever take. Now I've got a good fit, so I'll make sure to write trimmed on here. Now that all the roofs have been trimmed, I'm going to do some inking. I'm inking in on all of these edges. I'm inking the edge, and then I'll ink in underneath. And if my inking obscures the number, I'll make sure that I've got the number written on there so I don't get confused. So I'll repeat that for all the gable roofs we just sized. Next, for each one of our gable roofs that we have here, I'll cut a piece of finishing strip that is the exact length of that roof, and it has square ends. And with the roof in place, I'm going to add that finishing strip on top. I'll remove the other piece of score tape backing, and then I'll burnish that in place. And I'll repeat that for all the other gables. After I have those finishing strips installed, I'll go ahead and remove the blue tape from underneath on each one. For the pattern paper for our gable roofs, again, we can refer to the cutting guide and to our pattern paper layout. Building 3, the roof, we need 2 at 1 3/4 by 2 3/8. We may need to trim that a little bit because on one side just try it out. You can cut it to this dimension, and you may need to trim it if you ended up having to trim the roof for building 3. And building 3 is the, here it is, dark red plaid. So the dark red plaid is going to show for the building 3 roof. For the building 6 roof, the sizes are here again listed next to the roof. And again, if you had to trim on one side of the roof for 6, you may need to trim a little bit of this down, but first cut it to size and then see if you need to trim it. And for the 6 roof, it's going to be the reverse side of the green snowflakes, which I call the green and red plaid. You can get it out of this piece right here. Building 7 roof, the pattern paper dimensions are here. It's coming out of the chevrons, which are the reverse side of the green dots, and we have sufficient to get it out of here. And you should have sufficient in all of these to be able to match things up if you care about that. Building 8. The roof here, we have the pattern paper listed, and then it's coming out of the white with dashed lines, and that's actually the side we'll use for the roof for building 8. And then for the annex roof, the pattern paper is listed here, and then it's coming out of the green stripes, which is the reverse of this black with the flowers. And we will also use a piece of this in a moment for the annex on the building 4 annex. So I'm going to cut all of my paper according to my guide and the colors that I just showed you that are listed on here, and then I will ink them up and go ahead and get them installed on the gable roofs. Now don't attach any roofs at this point. And then this is the annex roof for building 4, and I've inked the edges, and then you remember I said that I was using the green striped paper, so I've prepped the edges, and I'll just go ahead and attach that paper to this roof. So now we're ready to attach our roofs, and I have the village in its closed position, and you can see I put a nice amount of glue here. I'm getting ready to put on the roof for building 1. It may overhang in some areas, but it should always come at least to the edge of a building. So I'm going to put this one on, and then I'll put a little pressure on here. Then I'm going to open it up and make sure that it is at least to the edge of these inside places. And then I'll just hold some pressure on it and just wait for a few minutes before I move on to the next roof. Now for roof for building 3, I'll remember I have a trimmed side. I'll get that on, and I have it pressed back pretty tightly against building 4 there. Once I get it in place, I'm going to hold it down and then open it up and make sure that it is coming at least to the edge on the inside there. Because I can see I've got an overhang here. It should come at least to the edge here where it butts into the North Pole, and back here where it goes into building 4. And once I've checked that, I'll just again put some pressure on that. The roof for building 4, you can see I've turned the village around here, should be able to be just centered on the building because there's a gap here by the North Pole. For the number 4 annex roof, I'm going to get out my detail gluer and just put some glue along that top edge and along these edges here. And then I'll just center this roof and make sure it is tight up against building 4. For building 5, I'll just center this on this roof, and then I will check on the inside and this side that comes into building 4 and make sure that the edge is coming at least to the edge of the building. For the roof for building 6, remember if you trim something to put that on the proper side. Again, install it and then check to make sure its edges are at least even with all of the other edges here on 7 and coming into 5. You probably have an overhang on the outside edges. Building 6 is kind of a bigger roof, so hold some pressure on the corners as well. The roof for building 7 can overhang on 3 edges, and you want to make sure that it comes at least to this edge over here by the front. I'm going to put a little bit more glue right near that edge. For building 8, we can overhang on the 2 long sides and the front, and make sure that this back edge that's coming up against building 7 goes at least to the edge of the building. And then our last little roof that goes on the 8 Annex, there it just can butt up right against building 8, and there's no overhang considerations to worry about. And then all we have left to do is finish the roof for the North Pole. To make the roof cap for the North Pole, we have 3 pieces of chipboard left inside of our number 2 baggie. 2 pieces are labeled cap, and 1 piece is cap inside. Then we'll also need a piece of our ledger strip, and then this is our strip of 1/4 inch joining cardstock that we cut in the beginning. I'm going to start by cutting 4 pieces of the ledger strip that are 1 3/4 inches long. 1 3/4 inches. Next, I'll remove the score tape backing from these 4 pieces, and I'll put them end to end along my strip, starting exactly at one end. So just butt them all 4 up against each other. So I know it's hard to see this on the black cardstock, but here they are all joined. And then I cut this off a little bit long and put some score tape on there so that I can use that tab to join these to make a square. And I'll just make a butt join here in this last join. Next, I want to punch a 1/8 inch hole in one of the cap pieces and the cap inside piece. So I've marked diagonals on both pieces, and the intersection is where the 1/8 hole will go. Now that 1/8 hole is used to hold a small piece of sharpened dowel that we will eventually put our styrofoam ball on. So you want to be as careful as possible when punching these holes, because that will make sure that the dowel gets centrally located on the cap. Now that I have my holes punched, I'll put the cap piece aside for a moment, and I'll take my little unit that I built. These are the side walls for the cap. I'm going to run a bead of glue on the inside bottom edge and then put the cap inside down inside of there. Once you have the cap inside there, make sure that the walls are tight against that cap and allow that to dry. While that side piece is drying, I can do a little inking, and on each of my cap pieces I'm going to come in on the top edge, and I'll do the side edge, and I'll just come just slightly on that underneath edge so that I know that my edges here are truly inked. And I'll repeat that for the other piece. Now it's time for some assembly, so I'll take the piece that does not have a hole and flip it so the ink side is facing down. And then this is my inside piece, and I prepped the base with some glue, and it should line up exactly on the edges of the cap piece. So get it aligned and then put some pressure on that. And probably the best way to do that is just to turn this little unit upside down. And then once you have this unit made, run some glue along these top edges here and put the other cap piece on. And I've just taken my piece of dowel and put that through and made sure it went into that bottom hole, and just check that your dowel is nice and straight, and then allow that to dry. While that's drying, we can prep our pattern paper according to our pattern paper layout. The red dots is being used for the roof here, and we have not used this paper before. I'm going to cut a strip the length of the paper that is 1/4 inch wide, and then a square that is 1 3/4. So a strip 1/4 and a square 1 3/4. I'm going to ink the edges on both of these pieces, and then I'll prep the square with score tape, and I'll make sure that there's some score tape in the center because that's where the styrofoam ball will be attached. Don't attach score tape to this piece yet. Now on our strip, we're going to do some scoring. We're going to score first at 1 7/8, 1 7/8, and then 3 3/4, 5 5/8, 5 5/8, and then finally 7 1/2. So that was 1 7/8, 3 3/4, 5 5/8, and 7 1/2. And then fold on those creases and reinforce with your bone folder or your fingernail to get a nice sharp crease. We're going to use this piece to finish off the sides of our cap. I have found the best way to maintain these sharp corners is to not run a strip the entire length, but to put individual pieces, and they don't have to go exactly to the corners because, you know, on here, I don't know if you can see this, but the corners stop 1/16 of an inch short of the actual corner. And then I'll put a piece on this little 1/2 inch tab at the end. So here's my strip prepped with score tape, and I'm going to remove the little 1/2 inch tab from the end. And then I'm going to put one of the 1 7/8 inch strips down on the side and kind of fold it like this. It should get centered on our ledger strip, and when it's centered, then reach over here and push down the little tab. And then proceed around, just taking off one piece of score tape, backing at a time, and getting that nice and centered in the cap, and then moving on to the next section. That way you should maintain some nice corners here, even though there isn't any chipboard exactly behind that corner. And there's our edge on, and then we can remove the score tape backing from this piece and put it on the side with a hole on it. Just center it right there. Next, I'm going to take my craft knife and my dowel and just kind of whittle one end down to kind of a point. It doesn't have to be very, very sharp point, but a fairly sharp point. And I'll do that and I'll be back. So here's my sharp point. I just darkened it a little bit so you can see it. And I'm going to cut this to length, and it will be 1 inch from that point to where we cut it off. And then so I can figure out where to push in to put my dowel in, I'm just going to lightly mark my X in the center, just in the center where it'll get covered up, or you can of course erase it after you've punched the hole. Once you've punched the hole, you can squirt a little glue down inside of there and put the dowel down inside. Then we can bring the village in and put some glue up here on the top of the North Pole and center our cap. Just check it out from several directions and then put some pressure on for a few minutes and allow that to dry. Once the cap has dried, we can put some glue in this bottom depression of our styrofoam ball, and when you go to put this on, I suggest that you look down on it to make sure it's centered that way, and then from several sides before you put pressure on it and get it all the way seated. And that completes the North Pole cap.